Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Once I think Scott gives the introduction, then I'll stop sharing, and then you can start sharing, Dr. Stevens.
Okay.
Still waiting for the last presenters to get here.
Wait, how many? We have one more who's missing, right?
Yeah, Darling Curtis. I'm not sure where he is right now.
Okay. Okay. So our final speaker. All right. All right. I got 10:59 on my watch. I don't know about everybody else. So we shall get ready to begin. Okay. Hey, most pleasant good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good day to everybody who is watching this amazing webinar series that we have been doing. And I just want to say thank you for joining us for this webinar session highlighting the research done in the Bahamas by amazing scientists. My name is Scott Johnson, and I will be your moderator for today's conference. This is the finale, the final presentations, the final set of presentations for this year's webinar series. The Bahamas Natural History Conference is the Bahamas' largest scientific conference, and it's held every 2 years by the Bahamas National Trust. The BNHC gives researchers working in the environmental and natural sciences field an opportunity to share their work with peers, policymakers, and the general public. And currently, due to the effects of COVID, we have adapted the conference to the situation that we are in now. And this is our final week of this virtual webinar series, which we shortened to BNHCV. This week's webinar, final webinar session, will be focusing on the terrestrial side of the Bahamas. Last week, we had a lot of very cool talks about marine wildlife. But this week, we're going to be focusing on the terrestrial side of things. So without further ado, our first presenter is Dr. Mark Stevens of the University of the Bahamas. And the title of his presentation is Disturbance of Karst, Caves and Blue Holes, Resources on New Providence Island, Perspectives for Geoconservation and Land Use Planning. So Dr. Stevens, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. I hope everybody can see this.
No, I can't see the screen
yet. Can you see it now?
No, unfortunately.
Okay.
Okay, now we can see it.
You got it. Okay, thank you.
So
thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to present here. Really looking forward to sharing this work and receiving some feedback on the work and how it can proceed. And we've got a couple of images here. On the left, this is one of the blue holes. It's in Golden Gates. It's called the Mermaid's Pool. And there are some UB students there that we took on a field trip. It was a joint geography and journalism field trip, and they even produced a blog on some of the different blue holes on New Providence Island. And on the right, we've got a recent development. This is not too far from Firth Avenue. And yeah, this shows some of the disturbance, and even a cave has been destroyed through this process. And yeah, so we're looking at a disturbance of karst, including caves and blue holes, and perspectives for geoconservation and land use planning. Okay, so I'm based in the School of Chemistry, Environmental and Life Sciences, and I'm also part of the Small Island Sustainability Research Complex at UB. So I'll move on to the next slide. So here's the outline. We'll look at caves and blue holes, why they're important, how do they form, where do we find them, urbanization, importance of geoconservation and land use planning, the karst disturbance index, summary and future work and acknowledgements. So caves and blue holes form in karst. What is karst? It's an area of rock that is it's been chemically dissolved. It produces features such as sinkholes, blue holes, streams, caves. It's most commonly made of limestone because limestone is fairly soluble. So when it rains, the water passes through soil, producing a carbonic acid, and that it's a weak acid and can dissolve the rock, producing these features. Why are they important? We build on limestone landscapes. We extract groundwater from limestone landscapes. Blue holes and caves act as natural traps in the landscape. We can find fossils. There are modern habitats for creatures like fish. They're important for recreation and geotourism for sustainable revenue. Here's an image of some of the issues of karst in the built environment. The problem of sinkholes. You can see here this house in Florida has been affected. And karst is it's a good aquifer. The limestone is a good aquifer for groundwater. So we can see the uses of karst. So we live on them, but we must build properly and extract the groundwater sustainably. And like I said, these blue holes can act as natural traps for sediment. And here's an interesting record published by Van Hengstem et al. From a blue hole on Great Abaco Island. And so they've taken a core of sediment and they plotted it on a graph how the sand and silt has changed through time, going from 1,100 years ago to the present day. And they've even been able to pick out hurricane activity from the changing grain size. And then they've compared this with sea surface temperatures also reconstructed from sediments in the ocean. And you can see at times of high ocean temperatures, you've got more hurricanes occurring. And it's the same at the present day. High ocean temperatures, more hurricanes occurring. So they're a very important resource for us to use for these kind of scientific investigations. And also you find fossils in blue holes and in caves. Also in caves, you can find pottery, archaeology. Here's some Locayan pottery sherds from Clifton Pier Rock Shelter on New Providence Island, published by Winter in 1979. Also important as modern habitats. Here's a recent picture I took from Locayan National Park, some grey snapper that have adapted to the freshwater system in the caves there. How do blue holes form? They form in a variety of ways. We see them on the ground surface as a hole that goes down. But if you look at it in cross section, imagine you cut the land in half like you would slice a cake and look at it on the inside. And you can see, so in A, you could have a pre-existing vertical cave formed from dissolution from rainwater. And then, for example, sea level rise after the last ice age, the cave would then, the sinkhole would then be, the blue hole would be submerged. And you can see water in it. In B, you've got a cave that's formed underground at the groundwater table from the dissolution caused by the groundwater. And then with a rising sea level after the last ice age, the ceiling continues to collapse inwards and you end up with a hole full of water. And in C here, you've got the zone between the fresh water and the salty water, you've got some, apparently it's more aggressive conditions for solution here. So you can end up with cavities forming along that zone. And then in D, you could have a fracture, like a fault, and then a blue hole occurring on that pre-existing weakness. So then you would see a hole above that fracture. So this is from a study by Milroy, another study by Milroy and Carew this time, showing us the different types of caves in the Bahamas. So we've got pit caves from vertical dissolution, from rainwater, meteoric water. And you've got caves forming at this groundwater table level. Here's an active one here, forming here and here at that level. Here's an abandoned one, perhaps from a former higher sea level in the past. So you get this shape of cave forming at this former sea level. And then you could have something called like a banana hole. It's this kind of banana shape where the ceiling has collapsed inwards and you've got where the cave used to be. Underground, it's now exposed. So there's three different types. And so where the cave formed at the edge of the island at the former zone of where the freshwater and seawater met, we call this a flank margin cave. So pit cave, banana hole cave, and flank margin cave. Where are the caves and blue holes on New Providence Island? So I've plotted them on this map. The black dots are the blue holes, the stars are the caves. What's really interesting, it's been pointed out to me by Neil Seeley, is the blue holes form almost on a straight line. So if we can see here, and so they're likely controlled by some faulting within the island, whereas the caves, some of the caves also appear in this zone, and you also get caves closer to the coast, which are more likely to be the flank margin type. And urbanization has been occurring quite rapidly in the last 50 years or so. Seeley did a study in 2004 and found significant loss of patch reefs and seagrass areas because of increasing development. So we know about the environmental disturbances. Perhaps lesser known are impacts on caves. So Hunt's Cave was almost completely destroyed. It's even labelled on the New Providence Island 1 to 25,000 map, and that was destroyed due to ridge cutting. And I've seen some photographs of it from 2013 after it was destroyed, and we can just see fragments of it remaining. But it was a great cave. It was a big cave. It had bats, stalagmites, stalactites, really interesting. So, and these caves can be a really important resource for us, for science, for geotourism. So I'm keen to promote that the interest in these resources. And many other caves and blue holes have otherwise been surrounded by this urban sprawl. And there are 3 publicly accessible sites we can see in these images below that I'll describe in this presentation. We've got Caves Point Caves out west, just past Sandyport and Delaport. We've got R.M. Bailey Blue Hole, which is near the R.M. Bailey School, and it's near the intersection close to Marathon Mall. We've got the Mermaid's Hole at Golden Gates. You can see it's surrounded by a residential development. I've heard that in the 1960s, this was all bush. So we can see how it's developed since then. And obviously here, got this major intersection. And so geoconservation, it's important and to be a part of land use planning. And geoconservation is action taken with the intent of conserving and enhancing geological, geomorphological and soil features, processes, sites and specimens, including associated promotional and awareness raising activities, and the recording and rescue of data or specimens from features and sites threatened with loss or damage. I've recently published a paper on geoconservation for sustainable development in a UN SDG publication. So the primeval forest on this island, it's a really excellent example of the management of karst and amenity and geotourism by the BNT. And so I've applied the karst disturbance index of selected caves and blue holes. It's a reconnaissance study at the moment. And this is a really appropriate index to use. It's hierarchical and standardized. It's specific to karst. It's got 31 indicators using the broad categories of geomorphology. So we can see geomorphology, air pollution, hydrology, biota, cultural. And then there's more detail under each of these that can be used to be described and analyzed. So each indicator, so for example, geomorphology has all these indicators, including quarrying, infilling, dumping, erosion. Each indicator has a description of what constitutes the score from 0 to 3. The final karst disturbance index score is calculated by adding the scores for each indicator divided by the total possible score. So we've got a total possible, and a final KDI score. And we've also got LD, lack of data. This is given where the assessor is unable to give an exact score. The number of LDs is then added and divided by the total number of used indicators to give the degree of confidence of the KDI. So typically, if there are too many LDs, we don't have data on enough of these indicators, then the confidence in the overall KDI score could be lower. So we try and get as much data as we can. So let's have a look at the three sites, Mermaid's Pool and Golden Gates. It's a really beautiful blue hole. Really almost perfectly round blue hole, surrounded by some lush vegetation. Obviously, there's a residential area there, and the hole is used. Apparently, people swimming there. I've heard stories of a sewage truck in the 1980s apparently dumping sewage in there. Also, possibly a tractor and cars. Reportedly, a chlorine tablet is placed into the blue hole every hot season, so people can swim in there. And littering occurs. And there's no interpretive information, unfortunately, and that's something I'd be interested to improve. There was a study from 1970 by Cohen and Robbins, and they found a new ophidioid fish, genus Lucifuga, in this pool. And there are still fish in there today. I saw some very small fish last year, and I did also see a person fishing there, so there might be bigger fish in there too. Around about 2014, apparently, the metal perimeter fence you can see, it was obviously installed to secure the site that has been torn down. What about RM Bailey Blue Hole? This is a really beautiful blue hole too. Again, it has a metal perimeter fence, also an older wooden fence, I noticed. However, there is a floating garbage patch, mostly styrofoam takeaway cartons and other plastics. The water is about 3 meters deep. A resident that was passing when I was there told me he used to swim there in the 1960s when water was really deep and clean. It's about 3 meters deep now. Trash covers the floor, including wooden structures that previously fenced the site, perhaps damaged by a hurricane. There are newspaper reports of fuel leaks very nearby that area, so likely the water has been polluted, the groundwater. And again, there's no interpretive information. It's right next to a school. There's a great opportunity there for to liaise with that school, the RM Bailey School, and I'm sure the school children go and sit there in their lunch breaks. And also, interestingly, I saw some really large fish in there, around 1/2 meter in size. They might be tilapia. Maybe they've deliberately been put in there for fishing. or maybe they're eating something in there that makes them grow so big. Caves Point Caves is the third publicly accessible site I'd like to describe. Really interesting caves. You've got this entrance area, and then you can go deeper into another cavern, and it's full of bats. And I went in there recently, and really large numbers of bats. In previous years I've been there, there were just a few bats, and I wonder if it's because of the lockdown that the bat numbers are increasing there. However, there is some disturbance. There's quite a lot of graffiti carved into the rock, footpath trampling. I'm sure that it disturbs the bats when people are going in and out there. It would be great if this could be managed with a warden, a guide, maybe a paid entrance with it fenced, and you know, and then there could be some sustainable income for the site. And here are some UB students on a field trip investigating the landforms, the stalactites in there. And so these are the scores that I created. I'm not going to go into detail on exactly, but it's based on these descriptions I've given you. And then, so for example, for Mermaid's Pool, for geomorphology, it's scored 10 based on all the indicators. For RM Bailey, it's 10. For Caves Point Caves, it's 8. For air pollution, I gave it 0 because in the KDI, it talks about desiccation and being affected by visitors and their breath and so on, rather than pollution from cars. But I think I might have to adjust that in the KDI so that pollution from nearby traffic is included. For the hydrology, we've got 4 for RM Bailey, 0 for Mermaid's Pool, 0 for Caves Point Caves. Biota is 4 for Mermaid's Pool, 4 for RM Bailey, 3 for Caves Point Caves. So that's based on the fish. Cultural, 9, 10, and 11, a total. Actually, at the end of the talk, I do have the detail. Let me just show you that, so you can see how I scored it. So, for example, Mermaid's Pool dumping, I gave it 3 because of these reports of possibly cars and tractors and rubbish being thrown in there. For RM Bailey, for dumping, 3 again, all the trash I could see in there, the wooden objects. Whereas Cave Point Caves, it was not so bad, so I scored it 1. So that just gives you an idea of how I was scoring these things. So I got a final KDI score of Mermaid's Pool of 0.38, 0.47 for RM Bailey, 0.32 for Caves Point Caves. So you can see RM Bailey had the highest disturbance score. Now, if we look at the categorization, between 0.4 to 0.5 is labeled as moderate disturbance. So that is RM Bailey. 0.38 for Mermaid's Pool is minor disturbance. Caves Point Caves, minor disturbance. But it is still disturbance, and that's something I want to emphasize. And this is reconnaissance at the moment. So, you know, these scores will probably be adjusted as we do more work. The KDI scores of the 3 sites on New Providence Island, I compared them with previous KDI studies from Florida, Mexico, Italy, New Zealand, and Botswana. This is a study I was involved with, published this year. And what we can see is the 3 scores from New Providence Island are ranging between 0.32 to 0.47. So more disturbance than the study in Mexico, similar to the one in New Zealand, more than the one in Botswana, but not as high as Florida and Italy, because in Florida there was large-scale infilling, dumping, leaching of agrochemicals, overutilization of groundwater. In Italy, deforestation, mining, quarrying, improper disposal of industrial and petroleum waste. These are quite large-scale studies. So just to summarize, RM Bailey classified as moderate disturbance, Mermaid's Pool and Caves Point Caves, minor. In the future, we're planning to do water quality analyses. So I've got a grant from UB to buy some equipment for that, to try and improve some of the LD scores. Collaborate with Dr. Andrej and Dr. Unwala at UB on the water analyses. Assess the caves and blue hole sites on New Providence. So I'm going to seek permission from landowners. probably have to visit lands and surveys to find who the landowners are, and maybe people at the BNT and AMMC might have that information too. I'm interested for student projects on these sites, potential community engagement. I'd love to be involved with, to help to design information panels and also with the students, to liaise with the BNT and AMMC, collaborate with Dr. Yildirim in journalism at UB for this activity, and then to write up for publication, including recommendations for future geoconservation efforts. I'd like to thank UB for the generous grant they've given me for this project. Neil Seeley has given me some really useful advice on the caves and blue holes, on their locations, and particularly in assisting for sites that are not mentioned in this talk. And just to end, sometimes it's difficult to find the sites, but it really helps when you've got a street name like this, Ocean Hole Drive. And so it really helped us to find this particular blue hole. So thank you for your attention.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens, for that amazing presentation. Just as a side note, if you are interested, it would be cool if you could get the UB students to also check out the cave formation, the rock formation on Collins Avenue. I see a lot of prehistoric tree roots growing on that rock formation. So that may be a nice little history lesson for the UB students as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So our next presentation is by Dr. Kristen Welch, hopefully I'm saying this right, Unwala. And her presentation, and she is also from the University of the Bahamas, and her presentation is entitled Isotope Anatomy of Hurricanes in the Bahamas, Irma, Maria, and Dorian.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As Mr. Johnson said, my talk today is titled Isotope Anatomy of Hurricanes in the Bahamas, Irma, Maria, and Dorian. My name is Kristen Welch Unwala. You did pronounce that correctly, thank you. I'm from the Small Island Studies program in the University of the Bahamas. And this research comes from a paper that I co-authored with Ricardo Sanchez Murillo from the National University of Costa Rica. As we all know, hurricanes drastically impact life on Earth. Hurricanes, or tropical cyclones, as they're also known, are atmospheric occurrences that have significant influence on terrestrial resources.
That is up next.
Projections estimate that over the next 30 years, Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes will increase in frequency by 2 to 3 times in the Atlantic Basin, which has drastic implications for those of us living in the Bahamas. Most recently, we saw the dire consequences last year that Hurricane Dorian left on the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Hurricane Dorian was the most intense hurricane on record for the Bahamas, with wind speeds over 185 miles an hour. For those of us living here, we've seen firsthand the destruction that hurricanes can cause to life and property. Not only do the excessively strong winds cause damage, but storm surges and intense rainfall can cause flooding that further endangers life and damages properties and ecosystems. Now, we know the damage that they can do, but understanding their properties can help us to understand their formation, evolution, and influences on land. For one example, in paleoclimatology, which is the study of past climates, understanding the hydrology of hurricanes is important for analyzing paleo records, such as tree rings, ice cores, fossils, corals, and shells that we use to tell us what climate was like years ago. As another example, understanding the hydrology of hurricanes helps us to understand how water moves through a landscape, which is particularly important for better understanding and protecting against flooding, and also making better predictions of the impacts of climate change. So I'm talking about hydrology, and I want to explain what I mean by that. So here we're looking at the water cycle. We have water flowing through the landscape. So water flows down as rain, as we see in the top left, precipitation. It moves through the landscape underneath through groundwater, and then evaporates back up into the air and forms one large cycle. Now, in my general research, I'm interested in sampling the different components such as rain or surface water or groundwater to understand how water flows through the landscape and what impacts that. In this specific study, we're looking just at rain to understand what the input into the system looks like, and later we can eventually see if we can track that rain. Despite the well-known hurricane season in the Atlantic region and the incredible impact that hurricanes have on the islands of the Bahamas, rain observations are lacking, which can provide information about the formation and evolution of the hurricanes and how these pulses of intense rain that we observe during hurricanes cycle through the landscape, as I showed in the last slide with the water cycle. So the methods of the study, we're using a technique called stable isotope analysis. Stable isotopes are like a water fingerprint. You may recall that water is a molecule of 1 hydrogen and 2 oxygen atom, H2O, which is possibly the most famous molecule on Earth. All water molecules look and taste the same, but in reality, some of these atoms are different because they may have an extra neutron in their nucleus. And so these extra neutrons mean that they may behave slightly differently because of the small amount of extra mass that they have. So since I'm studying water, then I'm obviously interested in hydrogen and oxygen. And the most common isotope examples are hydrogen-2 and oxygen-18. Typically, hydrogen has 1 proton and oxygen typically is 16, but in this case, we're looking at hydrogen-2 and oxygen-18. So these isotopes are found in nature in very small amounts. If you look at the abundance that I've listed here for hydrogen, 99.984% of all hydrogen atoms are hydrogen-1, the most common atom, and then only 0.016% are hydrogen-2. I just want to make note when I show my results that the notation that stable isotopes are reported is a delta notation. So it's a ratio of the isotopes in your sample to a standard, which in this case is ocean water for hydrogen and oxygen. So I collect water samples to see how many of those molecules have hydrogen-2 or oxygen-18 in the molecule, which is, again, a very small amount, as I said in the last slide. But because these atoms are present in such a small amount, we can use them as a water fingerprint to track how water moves because of their extra mass, like I talked about previously. And how we use this information in hydrology is by tracking it through a landscape. So I'm showing here a profile of the land where it meets the ocean at the left. And we talked about the water cycle before, and essentially it all starts with ocean water evaporating into the air. And then that water moisture that's in the air travels inland and it rains. And then, as you can imagine, if you have atoms that are lighter versus heavier, the heavier isotopes are going to rain first, meaning that there's more of the isotopes that I'm examining in the rain compared to the air moisture. Then, as the air mass moves further inland, it will rain again. And still the heavier isotopes rain out first, but not as much as the first rain event because you're initially going to see more heavy rain coming out first. So understanding these basic properties and how isotopes behave can tell us a lot about water movement in a landscape and then provide that water fingerprint like I was talking about earlier. So now that we have understand about the backgrounds, about the methods of the study, I wanted to show which hurricanes that we were looking at. So this map shows the paths of the hurricanes that were part of the study. We examined 2 hurricanes that affected Costa Rica, Otto and Nate in 2016 and 2017, and 3 in the Bahamas, Hurricane Irma, Maria, which were in 2017, and Hurricane Dorian in 2019. So the focus of this talk is on hurricanes impacting the Bahamas, although I will show some of the data from Costa Rica as well. And samples were collected for the Bahamian hurricanes. Obviously, they were collected here in the Bahamas, in Nassau. And as you can note, we weren't in the direct path of the hurricane there, as we only experienced the outer bands of all of these storms. So during the 3 hurricanes in the Bahamas, we collected a total of 46 samples, rain samples. So to collect samples, we use a passive funnel collector, as shown here. So this is one that I used in my front yard, weighed down with sandbags and using lots of duct tape to avoid it flying off in the hurricane. Now, typically during rain events or hurricanes, scientists collect 1 sample of the entire storm, but we sampled at a higher frequency in this study. So before, during, and after the storm, and at intervals ranging from approximately 15 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the intensity of the rain. So obviously when it's raining more, we would collect samples more frequently. So this is the first study in the region with high frequency rain sampling of isotopes during hurricanes. So there's many limitations, as you can imagine, of collecting samples during hurricanes. Unless you have an automatic sampler, you need to physically collect the samples, which requires you to go outside during a hurricane. But fortunately, I was able to do this during these storms, primarily because we weren't in the direct path of the storm. But the sampling requires collection during hazardous conditions, as you obviously can't collect during extremely high winds. So during those hurricanes, we experienced winds of about 30 miles per hour on average during the higher points of the storm. So that was where I was able to collect samples. But safety is a major factor and a limitation in general from collecting samples for this type of study. And I was able to collect in the front yard of my house where I was riding out these storms, but otherwise, if they had been placed in other locations, I wouldn't have been able to collect this frequency of data, or if the conditions had been more hazardous. So here we show the results from all of the hurricanes in Costa Rica and in the Bahamas, as well as two storms in Irma and Maria that were collected in Cuba. As is typical with water isotope samples, if you plot them on a regression line, comparing hydrogen-2 versus oxygen-18 ratios, then we see that the samples fall along a straight line. So this is typical. And I've shown this black line here is the global meteoric water line. So the global meteoric water line is an average of all rain samples collected around the world historically. And we would expect for samples to fall on this line unless some major process had affected the samples, such as evaporation. We noted in our study that samples from hurricanes that had primarily continental passages over land, those that fell in Costa Rica, were primarily plotting on the bottom left, meaning that they were lighter isotopes, and the heavier water molecules were mostly seen in the hurricanes with maritime passages, such as in the Bahamas in the upper right. And in the bottom right, there's an inset graph here showing the histogram of the count of how many samples that had different oxygen-18 values. So you can see that the number of samples are highest around -5, which you see as they're bunched on the larger graph. And here I've just isolated the samples from the Bahamian hurricane, so you can see how these samples compare to the others. When we had the other samples, they were along this whole line, but in the Bahamas, they were primarily these heavier isotopes in the top right portion. So this is just the first stage of a potentially much larger project and something that we've been working on with other scientists in the region and other countries. The implications of this study is that these data can help us better understand hurricane processes, which can eventually lead to better predictions of hurricanes. As an example, stable isotope data can be used in combination with satellite data to understand the evolution of hurricanes. And in addition, we observed that offshore convection, where you have rising air masses due to heat, resulted in heavier isotope rainfall amounts during these hurricane passages. So these are typically results that you'd expect to see in drier conditions when just in normal rain samples. So thinking back to the slide that I showed you of isotope hydrology, when conditions are dry or you have initial rainfall, then the heaviest isotopes rain out first. During high rainfall events, then essentially there's so much rain that it's not discriminating and more of the lighter isotopes rain out. But this wasn't the case with the hurricanes where we saw very high amounts of rainfall. The implications of this is that the information can be used to help us analyze paleo records, as I talked about earlier with the tree rings, fossils, corals, and shells, those items we use to reconstruct past climates. So results that indicate heavier isotopes might normally be interpreted as periods of drier conditions when in reality they could be caused by hurricanes as well. So this was the first study to date of isotope hurricane anatomy in this region of the world. In the Bahamas specifically, more work is necessary to understand hurricane hydrology and using this technique, which can provide us with more understanding of how water cycles through the landscape, flood processes, and climate change. More meteorological studies are necessary since rain influences all processes on land. And the Bahamas is ideal for this research due to not only the scarcity of data on this, but also because the location is ideal for collection of hurricane samples, although not ideal for those of us experiencing hurricanes. If you're interested in more information, I'm showing two papers that highlight the data that I presented today. The paper at the top is the one that primarily summarizes this research, which was just published in Data and Brief in June. And then another paper below that focuses mainly on Costa Rican data, but discusses the data from Irma and Maria that was published last year in Nature Communications. So I'd like to thank the Stable Isotope Laboratory at the National University in Costa Rica for running these samples. And I would also like to acknowledge the funding for this project that was provided by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And in addition, I'd like to thank the Bahamas National Trust for organizing this conference and their work in promoting science in this country, and specifically to Giselle Dean for organizing the logistics of this talk amidst a very challenging time. So thanks to all of you, and I'd like to urge you to stay safe this hurricane season. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Welch and Walla, for that amazing presentation. And we look forward to seeing what your research, what other new insights your research is going to turn up in the hopefully not too distant future. So for everybody, I just want to give you guys a reminder that this session is being recorded and is streaming live on Facebook. And after today's session, the recordings will be available to all, to everyone who visits the Bahamas National Trust's Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And I would like to if you would like to keep and get in touch with BNHC, you can do so by visiting our website, bnhc242.com and facebook.com/the BNHC to follow social media updates. And before we jump into our third speaker, I would just like to inform you guys of the Natural History of the Bahamas Field Guide, that recent publication that just came out. It's an ultra comprehensive guide of terrestrial and coastal flora and fauna, including species and common names, locations, and detailed descriptions. It also has some very interesting information about the geology of the Bahamas. So Dr. Stevens, I think that this would be a great book for you to have. In fact, all of you, I strongly recommend purchasing this book if you have not already. It's over 700 color photos, and it's available locally at Logos, Media Enterprises, and National Park offices. You can also purchase it online on Cornell University Press, online book retailers, and Amazon. And probably the best part of this whole thing is that the royalties come to the Bahamas National Trust so that we can continue doing the amazing work that we've been doing. All right. With that being said, our next presenter is Dr. Nicholas Milton of the University of Birmingham. And his presentation is entitled A Historical and Ecological Assessment of the Bahamas in the 1890s based on the diaries of Neville Chamberlain. So, Dr. Milton.
Thank you very much, Scott. Just I wanted to thank particularly the Bahamas National Trust for inviting me to speak to you today. I think you've given me a doctorate. I don't actually have one, but it would be nice to think that maybe one day I will be Dr. Milton. But anyway, just wanted to say a big welcome from Birmingham in the UK. It's cloudy here and not as hot as I expect it is with a lot of you. I'm going to be talking today about Neville Chamberlain's legacy. So I have been following the Bahamas Natural History Conference, some of the talks. I've been very impressed with what I've seen and heard. Obviously, you've got quite a scientific focus. My focus is natural history, both parts of those words, both nature and history. But I want you to know that I'll be bringing it very much back to the present at the end of the talk, when we'll be talking a little bit more about ecotourism. Can I just check, Scott, that you can see my screen and that everybody can hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, we can see the screen and we can hear you.
Great, that's good. Okay, so I'll start. So first of all, a little bit about me. So my name is Nick Milton. I'm a journalist, and I've written for the Guardian newspaper, actually for a variety of British newspapers for about 20 odd years. I've also worked in the environmental movement. I worked for Greenpeace for quite a time, and last year I published my first book on Neville Chamberlain, and he spent nearly 7 years in the Bahamas. So I thought maybe I should start off by saying a little bit, because I expect a lot of you won't necessarily have heard of him, or if you do, you won't know who he is and why he's important. So as I say, I wrote the book last year. It's based on letters that he sent to his two sisters. All of the Chamberlains were prolific letter writers, very much of their time, what this has given us is it's given us a really good historical resource that people like me can go back and see what they were thinking and what was actually happening. You know, pretty much primary source material, which is great. It tells the story of one of the most controversial politicians of the 20th century. Now, Neville Chamberlain, we'll come on very briefly to this, declared war on Germany in 1939, plunging the world into the biggest conflict that we've ever seen. But it tells it not through that lens, but through his love of natural history. Very little has been written about this, but he was a very accomplished, very experienced natural historian, and with a particular interest in lepidoptery, and I'll come on to a little bit to that. So first of all, very briefly, and I'll skip through this, but just so that you have a flavour of who he is, and then we'll come on to his time in the Bahamas and what it tells us a little bit about your history. Arthur Neville Chamberlain was born in 1869 in Birmingham. Birmingham is Britain's second biggest city, still is today. At the time he was born there, it was called the workshop of the world, and it literally was responsible for a lot of the engineering that held together the British Empire at the time. His father, Joseph, was a very prominent politician of his era. He served in the cabinet. He was a Liberal politician, and he was a very successful businessman as well. He was a joint partner in a screw-making business, and so his screws literally held the British Empire together. Joseph had been married before. His first wife had given him 2 children, one of whom was Neville's elder brother called Austin. She had died in childbirth, and he had remarried. His second wife was called Louisa, and she was to give him 3 more children, including Neville. Neville was born in 1869, was the eldest. He then had 3 sisters, Hilda, Ida and Ethel. And then tragedy struck in 1875 when, to have a lot of children in those days, when during the birth of his 5th child, his second wife died and the child died as well. So a quite important part of understanding Neville Chamberlain's decisions later on in life is that he grew up with no mother, and a very austere, a very important father who was away all the time in Parliament, always away on important business. So Neville formed a very close relationship with his sisters, particularly the 2 youngest. The very youngest also died quite young. So he came from a family very interested in natural history. He had 2 uncles, one on his mother's side and one on his father's side. The one on his mother's side had accumulated a massive collection of birds from around the world, over 300 species, on expeditions, which he had donated to the British Museum. And on the other side, his mother's side, was an uncle called George. He was extremely into natural history, in particular butterflies and moths, lepidoptery, and he took Neville under his wing. So while his father was away, and as I say, was a Victorian Britain, very austere man, was very quite cold man, very talented man, but not perhaps prone to show love towards Neville. His lepidoptera-loving Uncle George took him under his wing and taught him everything he knew. Wasn't a gifted child at school. In fact, he struggled, despite going to some very good schools, he struggled to get hardly any qualifications at all. So what his father decided to do was the elder brother, Austin, would be the one who would follow in his footsteps and would go into politics. Neville would be left to run the family business. Now, at the age of 21 in 1890, he was sent to the Bahamas to grow sisal and make the family fortune. I'm going to come on to that in just a few moments, but we'll skip ahead a little bit just so that you can see how the rest of his life played out. In 1914, he became the mayor of Birmingham during the First World War, and after it decided to stand for election. By the time he entered the House of Commons, our Parliament, he was nearly 50 years old. So he was well into middle age before he got there. When he got there, he did a variety of backbench roles, as you normally do. But then through the family name, hard work, he was incredibly hardworking. He used to stay up night after night looking at technical aspects of really quite detailed legislation. And good luck. There was 3 general elections during that period. A lot of instability. As a result of that, he became a Minister for Health and then Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the person who was in charge of our finances. He finally became Prime Minister in 1937. And almost from the time he got into office, he had to deal with Adolf Hitler and Hitler's expansionist policies from Nazi Germany during the late 1930s. At the time, Hitler was expanding the German Reich and was seeking to unify it by bringing all Germans together under it. As a result of this, tensions grew rapidly in Europe, and this was very much his own initiative. In 1938, he decided to take the unprecedented step of flying to see Hitler. He'd never stepped into a plane before, and he did so 3 times in the space of nearly 2 weeks. That's the efforts that he went to. And on the 3rd time, they met at Munich, and there he got Hitler to sign a piece of paper guaranteeing that the 2 countries would not go to war again. And on coming back to Britain, following that final meeting, he got to Downing Street and declared peace for our time on 30th of September 1938. And at the time, he was the most popular politician of his era, possibly ever. He had prevented a second world war coming along, and he was inundated with gifts and cards and telegrams from grateful people from all over the world, including the Bahamas. However, peace was an illusion, and a little time later, not very long afterwards, Hitler annexed the whole of Czechoslovakia, and then in September 1939 declared war on Germany. So Neville Chamberlain was forced to declare war on Germany. Something the last thing he wanted to do was that. He had been scarred by the huge number of people who died during the First World War, and he was a very reluctant Prime Minister during wartime. It was not what suited him. There was a vote of confidence in the House of Commons in May 1940, and he survived that, but only very narrowly, and resigned not long afterwards. It's quite a sad tale to this, because almost as soon as he stepped down, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he died less than 6 months later in November 1940. So he never had a chance to write an autobiography. He never had a chance to give his side of events. That was all done by Winston Churchill afterwards, who blamed Chamberlain for a lot of the not standing up to Hitler and the Second World War. I think it's fair to say no politician has ever risen so high or fallen so quickly from grace. And his legacy remains incredibly controversial to this day. I was really surprised when I published the book last year. I had a serialization in a paper here, the Daily Telegraph, and there was a lot of letters came in arguing about whether his policy of appeasement was right or wrong, including some quite well-known people like Frederick Forsyth, the author. Okay, so we're moving on to his time on the Bahamas. So here's a picture of him, age 21, when he was sent out to the Bahamas. And here's a picture of him much later in life as a result of those 3 meetings with Adolf Hitler. Right, so why the Bahamas? So his father, as I mentioned, was a very prominent politician of his time. He was also a businessman. And I'd also mentioned that his first 2 wives had died in childbirth. He married again. He married a much younger woman by the name of Mary Endicott, and she was actually only a few years older than Neville. She was American. As a result of that, he was visiting America in around about 1899 and visiting her family over there. And then they had a family holiday and they went over to Canada. And in the hotel in the same hotel staying with him was the governor of the Bahamas, Sir Ambrose Share. Now, I'm not sure whether he's somebody that any of you know anything about. My understanding is he was an Irishman, and he was a businessman, and he desperately wanted to get investment into the Bahamas. Anyway, he came across Joseph Chamberlain and convinced him that this was a place where hemp or sisal of the very best quality grew in the islands like a weed. That was the exact phrase that he used. So by this time, Joseph had accumulated very large debts. He'd had some bad investments that he'd made in South America, and he'd also built a new home for himself called Highbury Hall, which in today's equivalent would have cost him millions of pounds, and he very much needed the money. So convinced by Share, he sent Neville and his elder brother Austin there to the Bahamas to grow sisal in October 1890. And it gives you an idea of how times have changed, because they were sent together on the weekly mail steamship, and it took him until the 10th of November to arrive. So it took him about 15 days to get to the Bahamas. When he was there, he obviously met Share at the government house in Nassau, and then they left to prospect for the Bahamas on the 16th of November. Now, they visited quite a few of the islands. You can see some of them listed there: Great and Little Abaco, some of the southern islands in Agua, Maya Aguana, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Long Island and Rum Clay, among others. And he kept a diary of his time there, literally a daily diary, and wrote regular letters home. And that's how we've got a lot of this information. Finally, in the new year of 1891, he visited Andros, and it was here that he decided to establish the plantation. I'm just going to read you a very quick bit from the book about that particular period, when he first arrived on Andros. Neville was in ecstasy over the wildlife, writing home enthusiastically about the herons on the island. Then as now, they were a mecca for wealthy bird watchers, supporting over 80,000 flamingos, as well as parrots, pelicans, ducks and hummingbirds found nowhere else in the Bahamas. The two islands supported no fewer than 5 species of heron. For a bird watcher like Neville, coming from Britain, which only supports 1 species of heron, it was paradise. He also saw a vast colony of roseate or West Indian flamingos, swimming about like pink swans, and on Long Island he saw a huge diversity of striking butterflies. Here he chased about the island with a net in his hand, in hot chase after the most magnificent papilio I've ever seen. After running for about a mile at full speed, I lost him. The papilio in question was, of course, you will know this, the Bahamian swallowtail, a majestic butterfly with a 4-inch wingspan. Its name derived from the tail-like extension on its hind wings. Lastly, on their island recce, they visited Andros, which was so wild Neville had to make his way through swamps and drag their launch off sandbanks. However, the land was cheap, and it was here that Austin and Neville thought would be a good location to grow sisal. So they reserved 20,000 acres and returned home in February 1891 with a very favourable report saying that profits of up to 30% could be expected on the investment. After that, Neville only returned. His brother was lined up for a parliamentary career, indeed rose to become a foreign secretary. But Neville was sent back there, and he employed over 800 people and built a home, and then burnt, cleared and planted around 10,000 acres on Andros. He didn't just, he made a major investment in the island as well. He established his home at Mastic Point. His home apparently became like a zoo. He had all sorts of things. He had iguanas there, all sorts of species that he found out and about he would bring home. And he also built roads. He built a school, a shop, and even a bank. And over the next 6 years, with only very occasional trips home, he threw himself into the task of trying to make the sisal grow. It simply wouldn't grow well enough in the thin and arid soil. His Uncle George, the one who I'd mentioned was very into butterflies, sent him the only bird book that then existed, and he went about identifying most of the birds on the island. Being extremely interested in butterflies and moths, he also trapped and killed any unusual ones he found, and after he got back, sent them to the British Museum. Studying these a year after he got back, the British Museum's chief taxonomist, Arthur Gardner Butler, identified a new species to science and named it after him, the Chamberlain's yellow butterfly, Pteris chamberlainii. And he remains the only British Prime Minister, probably ever, to have discovered a new species to science and had it named after him. Just to finish off the story very briefly, in the winter of 1896, he had to finally admit defeat, and he sold off all the machinery, leaving for good in March of 1897. His father lost over £50,000 on the investment, or about £500,000 today. The land was eventually sold in 1921 for just £200. Yet far from this being a very negative experience for Neville, it was actually, he'd spent the formative years of his early life there, and he looked back on it fondly. He commented in 1897, he came back when Queen Victoria was celebrating her Jubilee, and he told a friend how far away the Bahamas seem already. He'd often think of it with very grateful recollections, for in spite of all the disappointments, it was a great experience, and I know that I'm much the better and stronger for it. I've got a picture of the butterfly here. I don't know if it's a species that any of you are familiar with. The male is magnificent. It's orange rather than yellow with those beautiful wingtips, but the female one there is obviously very yellow with the dark wingtips. And one of the things I was hoping to do, I was very much, we had a launch of the book at the House of Commons. The UK's ambassador came along, and Ellison Greenslade, who's been incredibly supportive of this. And we were very much hoping to come to the Bahamas to look at the distribution of that butterfly. But unfortunately, as we say, COVID got in the way. So I've got a few suggestions now. I think there's a very interesting story there. I mean, I've written a book about it, but others can judge. But there's definitely, and I don't know again whether you've got these things already, but there, as well as quite mine's a sort of 300-page sort of natural history, both of those words, book. But it's well worth producing some sort of tourist guide, I think, to his time on the islands. I would love to compare the bird reports in his diaries with the species survey today. That would give you an awful lot of information about, some of the declines, which I expect have happened in a lot of species. I'd love to have mapped the range of the butterfly that's been named after him. And again, I don't know whether you've done this or not, but I've taught some sort of exhibition, which the Bahamas the Bahamas Historical Museum about his time on the islands would be good. I'm in contact with the family. I'm actually going to see his grandson tomorrow. His grandson's 84, but has very good memories of his time with him, and they have an awful lot of information, as I say, including all the diaries, a whole range of photographs of his time on the Bahamas, which that's all within the family's possession. And finally, I thought, maybe the possibility of setting up some sort of scholarship or bursary in his name. So that's probably enough from me on him. But I hope, I think it's an amazing story. I know a lot of scientific research these days is very much focused on the here and now, but I think there is an awful lot to be gained in terms of looking at ecological decline, in terms of looking at environmental protection from being able to look back. And as I say, we've got these wonderful diaries, 6, nearly 7 years worth of them. They're very much of their time, but he, as I say, he records most of the things that he comes across on the islands in them. And I think it would be a really good resource to be able to study more. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Milton, for that very, very intriguing presentation. I look forward to reading your book if I ever get the chance to meet up with you and so we could just talk about stuff. And also, it would be great to compare the birds of yesteryear, of the 1800s, to the birds of today. And I think one of the ways in which you can do that is by using the eBird site. If you know about eBird, it's an online site that helps people catalog birds that they see in various locations on the around the world. So maybe that could help you with that as well. But I would still like to sit down and talk with you a little bit more about that as well.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, so fantastic presentation. And so for our final speaker is Mr. Dorlin Curtis of the Center for Sustainable Development in Cape Eleuthera. And his presentation is entitled Mycomaterials, an exploration of bioengineered materials and sustainable design. So without further ado, Mr. Curtis.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Let me start sharing my screen. Yeah. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dolan Curtis, and I will be joined by one of my research collaborators.
Hi, my name is Alan Jones, and we are going to talk about micromaterials and exploration of bioengineered materials and sustainable design.
So we are a research group called Phoncology that is being housed under the Center for Sustainable Development over in Cape Eleuthera at the Island School. So a little bit more about us as researchers. So my name is Dolan. I am right now the Assistant Director of Science and Engineering at CSD. Majority of my experience has been in sustainable waste management. So looking at how green waste can be utilized or upcycled into useful materials. My research is primarily focused on thermochemical extractions of woody biomass materials. So that is, extracting valuable chemicals such as cellulose as well as lignin from plant materials. So during my tenure at the Island School, in 2019, we started a mycology-based research program where we were looking at fungi's potential for bioremediation in the event that there was ever an oil spill or some chemical spill in the Bahamas. And we've also looked at its potential as a sustainable food source for the Island School.
So a little bit more about myself. I'm a fine art photographer, and I'm in the communications and marketing department at the Island School. And I'm an industrial designer. The bulk of my photography work is portrait and documentary photography. I've been doing it for about 10 years or so. And I've actually had the opportunity to be invited by Ms. Keisha Oliver to exhibit some of my work at the University of the Bahamas. I was also one of the artists selected in the country to exhibit their work at the National Art Gallery for their 9th national exhibition. I'm also a practicing industrial designer. I've been sketching and modeling and rendering 3D components using mostly Adobe and Autodesk suite of CAD and CAM software and design applications for about 3 years.
So diving into what we are here talking about today is looking at the world of fungi. So fungi, they are their own kingdom of organisms. They are essentially, they're not plants, they're neither animals. However, they do share elements of both kingdoms, more primarily looking at similarities with plants. So fungi, they do give off spores as a means of reproduction. And those spores, they then germinate and turn into materials called hyphae, which then are the basics for mycelium. So mycelium essentially are just the conglomeration or the polymerization of hyphae that then mature and turn into mushrooms. So in looking at how mycelium relates to the world of biomaterials, as we stated previously, they are simply the roots of a mushroom or a fungi. So when you go to the grocery store, you might purchase a mushroom, but what actually you're purchasing is simply the matured version or the vegetative state of mycelium. The interesting part about mycelium is that they are able to live and live simultaneously in their food. So as a result of this particular evolutionary trait, they are able to form bio-based composites simply through the inoculation of fungal material into substrates. And what is resulting is a material called mycomaterials. They are unique from their parent materials, meaning that they do form like solid structures. because they are living, they are able to be used in the growing design platform or spaces. They're biodegradable, meaning that once they are done or once they reach their end life, they can be returned back into nature, and they do not possess any chemical resins. And you compare them to solid structures such as fiberboard or pressure treated composite materials. In terms of its industrial application, we are not pioneering or doing anything necessarily new. There are companies around the world that are doing similar research. So in the world of biomaterials and textiles. So some examples would be like Pinatex that are actually using the residues from the agricultural production of pineapples to make leather. There are companies such as MycoWorks that are producing vegan leathers directly from mushrooms. And then also there are smaller startups such as Ecovative that are using this myco materials as a direct substitute to plastic packaging or styrofoam materials that will be used in products such as wines or in furniture that are commonly used in IKEA.
So what makes Pharmacology is a research project is housed at CSD. What makes it, to me, what's so different and exciting is that it takes advantage of the background, the scientific research background that Darlin has, and the various artistic discipline background that I have. So Pharmacology from its inception takes an interdisciplinary look and perspective at these topics and see how they can be, the intersectionality between them to get something that's really exciting.
And so 3 of those areas that we are looking at or we value within this project are looking at food security, sustainability, and industrial design, and seeing how the cross-pollination of these distinct areas are able to produce some scientific-based project. So in spring of 2019 at the Island School, we started a mycology project, as we said, with the hopes of producing mushrooms. So this plays into the food security profile within the Bahamas. About 92% of the food we consume is imported. And we saw the potential of mushrooms as being a direct substitute for animal proteins, as well as being able to produce locally in low-tech methods. So a lot of the mushrooms that we did cultivate were grown on simple substrates such as cardboard or wood chips. And for us, we were able to utilize this organic waste from ever being sent to, let's say, a dump site or composted. It was actually upgraded into food production.
Yeah, so sustainability, like Donna just mentioned, 60% of solid municipal waste that's generated globally is green waste, which means that goes directly into landfills that contributes to greenhouse emissions. This biomass can be diverted from landfills and be used to can be used to make upcycled substrates for food production and biocomposite materials. It also has a chance to introduce people to closed-loop systems, which gives them a chance to see the benefits of having closed-loop systems, understanding how the ecological effects of having closed-loop systems affect them in their everyday life, and encourages them into waste management. It also seeks to add alternative materials to the library and list of materials people want to use when they want to make things out of biodegradable materials. Usually this library of things, is very expensive. It's kind of boutique or exotic. This makes it, accessible to eco-conscious designers and biodegradable designs for people who have, temporary art projects they might think of, or even, let's say there are other materials to be used for festivals and junking and things like that. Industrial design purposes that Pharmacology wants to harness with these micromaterials is the unique properties and novel properties that these materials have. You have materials that can be both buoyant, malleable, and firm, while being highly firm. Is unique in the materials property, material science world, to get all these things rolled up in one. You even have some cases where you can get a substrate that has unique properties and a fungi that has unique properties, and you get the two of them to display even more unique properties. One being self-healing properties as well is something that is very exciting. You can also get repeatable and reproducible designs. By using handcrafted moldings or 3D printed moldings, you can shape designs that can be used to create mass reproductions of the exact same design. So you can play with designs that can be stacked, you can play with designs that need multiple components and be sure that you will get the exact same shape from the molds, which is kind of unique when you think about organically grown shapes, because you're to the will of the materials, growth rate, and other things like that. It's also important for accuracy. Custom designs, you can get custom designs from these grow shapes, other than other materials where you would need to mill it down to a particular specification that you need for manufacturing. These designs actually grow into the exact shape and design that you need. So it kind of offsets the cost of machining that other designs and other you're at the beck and mercy of. Additive and subtractive design. So usually when you have materials that can be grown, you can't really change or edit the design much more. Additive design means it grows into the shape that it is. Subtractive design means you whittle away from it. With these biomaterials, you can actually have the best of both worlds, and you can actually also have unibody designs as well, which means no assembly is required and no screws are required. Meaning the internal rigidity of the structures are much more contained.
All right, and so the entire research project is looking at making new materials. So what we are investigating is we have two primary waste streams here at the Island School. We have coffee that is consumed on a daily basis by our staff. On average, we produce about 40 pounds of just coffee waste per week. And we were also embarking upon an invasive tree removal initiative throughout our campus. So we were able to clear casuarina. In some cases, we were using it directly for furniture. But in our research case, we were looking at its potential to be inoculated with two fungal species, one being oyster mushroom, the other being shiitake, which are very common commercial mushrooms that you would find in the grocery stores in order to make alternative materials. So the three materials that we were targeting as a direct substitute would be styrofoam, medium density fiberboard, and plastic packaging. And this plays into the current ban that is in effect in the Bahamas as of July 31st, in that we do have a ban on styrofoam and plastic. And although there are alternatives to these particular materials, there are some limitations as to what paper packaging can do. And there are also forms of styrofoam that is in our supply chain. So although styrofoam containers are banned, we still import a fair bit of styrofoam when we bring in food, or if there are like packaging inserts or packaging, small packaging inserts in a lot of the orders that we do import into the country. So the research goals that we set to achieve throughout the duration of this project was to produce exotic materials to supply for designers or artisans that are focused on eco-conscious fabrication. We want to pilot like biomaterials research using indigenous biomass. So in our case, we are using casuarina, even though it's not necessarily a native species, it's currently growing, and there is potential of using this particular technology for processing invasive materials. And we also want to model or seek to model sustainable mushroom cultivation using low-tech means within the Bahamas. So the methods that we utilized for this project, first we were able to prepare substrates. So majority of the casuarina that we've had were available in either planks or wood chips. And we had to do a fair bit of processing to get it down into a form that the mushrooms can grow on. From that, we were able to inoculate the substrates with 2 strains of fungi. And they were casted in molds for a period of 60 to 75 days. Throughout that period, we did experience harvesting of mushrooms. As we said, we are working with living fungal material. And as a result, we do get a flush of mushrooms throughout the time of the project. At the end of that harvesting cycle, the material that is left is called a micromaterial, and it's hibernated for an additional 10 to 15-day period, and it's cured, and that material is then used for any micromaterial for any biomaterial applications. So in one of the studies that we conducted using oyster mushrooms as the fungal species, we can see at day 18, this is an example of coffee grounds that were inoculated with this fungal material. You can see it's clearly not loose. At this point, at day 18, we do notice that the structure has become firm. There is a composite material that is forming. As you can see, there is mycelium that has started to colonize the structure of the coffee. At day 39, we've observed that there has been pinning or some initiation of pinning of mushroom bodies. At day 45, within this particular species, we were able to harvest mushrooms. So from the screen, you can definitely see where this micromaterial, although it can be used as a styrofoam alternative, it's still also giving food at the same time. And after that curing and hibernation phase, we were able to produce prototypes that we will talk about in our results section.
Yes, so the prototypes that we were able to get from this experiment display their potential by showcasing their ability to be designed in simple and primitive shapes, meaning we have control over the shapes themselves and how they grow. Their structural integrity, being able to be freestanding and support their own weight without any external help or aid or apparatus. And whilst, like Dolan mentioned, producing harvestable mushrooms, being able to grow viable food that anyone could eat at the same time.
So, and looking at the next steps of this research project, we want to conduct more experimentation using new parent materials. In the scope of this research, we were limited with using coffee grounds as well as casuarina. We do want to target other invasive biomass that might be present within the Bahamas. So whether that's something like Brazilian pepper or tea tree, or any melaleuca, those are potential parent materials that we can use. And the next other steps, we want to look into producing more design molds or grow design molds. As we said previously, we were only able to produce primitive shapes. And so with being able to produce more design molds, we can get into more intricate geometries and sophisticated orientations. From the production of these new prototypes, what has to happen is looking or examining the material properties. So we do have materials fabricated, but we need to determine its buoyancy, its electrochemical potential, the temperature resistance, as well as its insulative properties. When we do compare it to traditional materials that are used, such as styrofoam or fiberboard or pressure treated materials. And last but not least, looking at the manufacturing of this material and fine-tuning the production method, so this is something that is viable and available to artisans or designers within the Bahamas. So in implications, or what have we found has the potential for this research project? As we said, this entire year we were able to produce mushrooms within our research class, and that is able to help to grow the local economy in terms of producing food with very low-tech cultivation methods. Because these materials are biodegradable, or they're able to be cultivated in a lab space, this does give the potential for micromaterials to be a prime candidate for eco-friendly designs. And these things can, like we said, be directly substituted for traditional materials that we use for shipping, for packaging, such as styrofoam. Because we do use, we are using all organic and material. This is prime time for us, or at least for the Bahamas, to emerge into a green economy by using things that are naturally available. Everything that we did use as a substrate were, just local biomass that we did find or invasive materials. And this was an ideal example or able to model a biotech industry that can emerge within the Bahamas. And last but not least, having the potential to catalog indigenous fungi that are present. We know that there are studies that were looking at fungal potentials, but in keeping with the sustainability component of our research project, we do want to catalog fungi that might be present on different islands in the Bahamas to determine how they do interact with parent materials to produce new exotic micromaterials. So we personally want to thank the Center for Sustainable Development, which is where our research is being housed out of. We want to thank the National Trust for allowing us to use this platform to talk about our research, as well as our students that were actively involved with our Spring 2019 mycology research, all of the interns at the Center for Sustainable Development that have helped over the course of the year, as well as my collaborator, Alan Jones. So you can follow us on social media. We post regularly about this research updates. You can contact us using our emails below.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Jones. That was a fantastic presentation. And I am very excited to see the work that is coming out. I love the infusion of the science with the art and creating these organic products that you guys are coming up with. I think that you guys are going to go far with this. And it's also great to learn a little bit more about the fungi. And if you're interested in learning more about what fungi species, or at least some species that are found in the Bahamas, you can also purchase our natural history of the Bahamas book, because that does have a section that looks at some of the fungal species that can be found there. And so now we move into the questions. And I know that there are a few questions that people have been sending. And I am going to start with, let me see. This question is, I think this one is aimed to Dr. Welch Anwala. And that is there a relationship between the distance of the sample from the central core of the hurricane?
Yes, so actually the isotope samples that you look at in hurricanes and in rain passages, the isotopes can change over space and time. So in one storm, you can have a variation of isotopes. There was a study done by, I think it was by Getzelman et al. In 2003, where they did isotope sampling in water vapor and rain during hurricane in flight, which is not research that I would be interested in doing, flying into hurricanes. They found that there were lighter isotopes about 50 to 250 kilometers from the eye, and isotopes were actually heavier closer to the eye wall. So yes, over the course of one storm, if you're looking spatially at different locations, you would see different samples of results.
Okay, and so I guess a follow-up to that question was, did the samples vary over the course of the storm passage?
Yes, so that was something that fortunately we could see since we were doing high frequency data collection. And it wasn't that we saw a rise in the heavier isotopes and then a decline, but in reality over time it was kind of going up and down. And so more information is needed to interpret those results, but there was a variation over time.
Okay, thank you. My other question is to another question for Dr. Anwala is, would the samples collected from the outer ring of the hurricane differ from the, okay, I think that this one may have been answered, but let me see. Would the samples collected from the outer ring of the hurricane differ from the samples collected from the denser region surrounding the eye? I think you may have answered that.
Yes, that's similar to what I answered.
Okay. The second question is, though they can be technically, I think this one is this one is for Mr. Curtis and Mr. Jones. Though they can be technically be returned to nature, what is the risk of escape and invasion?
So, like we said, we are conducting this in our lab, so we're not releasing, let's say, the material in nature. Nevertheless, like these fungal species are edible fungal species, and their primary function is to degrade wood materials. So they're pretty good at degrading like wood materials. So it isn't necessarily a high risk of escape unless it's like introduced into the wild. And in terms of invasion, like it's not, these are not pathogenic strains of fungi. So they're not pathogens to trees or to plant materials that are here. They're actually decomposers. So there's actually no risk of them being an invasive species.
Okay. The other question is again to Mr. Curtis and Mr. Jones. You mentioned that you were growing the fungal species in a controlled laboratory setting, yes?
Yeah.
How easily do you think your method could be implemented for the average person who might not have such facilities?
Can you repeat that?
How easily do you think your method could be implemented for the average person who might not have such facilities?
It's not something that someone can easily do and just for the average person. Like you said, it's a great deal of learning or knowing about the principles of mycology, as well as like bioengineering. So,
And that's why, we're seeking to make the material itself available, because making the material is it's such a learning curve, or such a, so hard to just tackle with.
yeah. So like you said, it does require a lot of knowledge of like learning the principles of mycology, but also fabricating this biomaterial. So it's not something that I would say someone would just can readily just do without understanding like, crucial like concepts of mushroom cultivation as well as material science.
Okay. This question is directed to Dr. Stevens. And the question is from one of your students. Will we have field trips to view everything that we've been taught since the country is open?
That's a great question. I'd love to go to those sites as soon as possible. And I did do some field trips to the blue holes and caves before the lockdown. So yeah, it's something I like to do. And then we can, see what the changes are like. And I had some other questions, and I already typed out the answer, and they're in the answer section of the Q&A. And again, there was a question about the blue holes and yeah, how they might have changed over time, and how maybe the Ministry of Environment and Housing might have been managing them with the fencing and so on.
Okay. So another question is again to Mr. Curtis and Mr. Jones, and that is, can some of the fungal materials also be fire resistant?
Yeah. So fungi, they can actually withstand like very high temperatures. So they have the potential to be fire resistant. We have actually did some tests and looking at how they burn. So unlike styrofoam that has a very low fire resistance and also gives off, let's say, noxious gases, these things, they can actually withstand high heat. They also tend to cure upon like subjection to fire or like high heat. So they do have the potential, like we said, to be a direct substitute to things that would be considered like flame resistant, or at least a supplement to them. So yeah.
Okay. This question is directed to Dr. Anwala. Are there any references for how outer band versus central samples may differ?
Yes, I can type that into the chat box, but one of the primary studies that I mentioned with the previous question was looking at that study of flight paths. So typically you don't have multiple samples being collected on the ground from one storm, but I can type out that reference in the chat box for anyone who's interested.
Okay, and a follow-up to that would be, what made the samples from Hurricane Otto spread so far along the graph compared to the others?
So we think that that was due to the origin of the hurricanes. So those hurricanes had mostly continental passages or land passages. So they pass over land before where they were sampled, whereas the samples from the Bahamas were more maritime passages, so passing over the ocean. That could have an impact in giving those heavier isotopes in there.
This is another question directed to Mr. Curtis and Mr. Jones. How does the fungal material scale to larger sizes? And is the texture and density consistent throughout?
So in terms of scaling to larger sizes, like we said, these are living, growing materials. So it's a matter of ensuring that you have enough material as well as you having a big enough mold. So I mean, we've actually like seen places where they actually use fungi as, let's just say, to produce buildings or roofs or structures. So it's just a matter of having adequate material to inoculate, as well as having enough, like, let's just say if you're trying to build a whole wall or let's say a table, like you need to definitely have a mold for that particular piece of equipment that you want to fabricate.
Or
So,
even
yeah.
if you have a series of, you know, predetermined blocks that after so many inoculation cycles, it builds up to a table or whatever the large structure may be.
Okay. Okay. So I have another question. This is, I think this is directed to Dr. Stevens again. Concerning the blue hole studies, has any analysis been done to the blue hole locale, the Royal Bahamas Police Force headquarters situated on East Street, sorry.
Okay, thank you. As far as I know, there haven't been any studies, and myself, I haven't done any studies there. But it's one I would like to include in the project. Now, East Street. So I haven't even been to that blue hole yet, so I'd welcome some. But if it's near the RBF headquarters, it sounds like it will be quite easy to find. And like with many of these sites, they're really quite difficult to find. And that's another part of the project. I want to document their locations, you know, the GPS coordinates. So I'll be really interested to see that site. And I'd be interested to know if you might have seen any disturbance at that site.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. Hold on. I got another question, and that is, has your study and publication on Chamberlain's life, and this is going out to Mr. Milton, changed popular opinion on him as an individual in your region?
Thank you, Scott. That's a great question. Yes, I think it's made a contribution to doing so. When the book came out, there was some publicity about it. I mean, I was hoping to do quite a lot of things this year, you know, book festivals and other things, but of course they haven't happened. But I think that the fact that he was so passionate about natural history, one of the other things he did when he got into Downing Street, he used to sneak out of the back all the time when a rare bird used to turn up. There's St. James's Park at the back of Downing Street, and he had a fellow bird watcher who used to send him in sightings from the park, and whenever something rare used to come along, he used to sneak out the back and go and see it. Now, you know, you imagine a prime minister these days doing that, and he he also did that in wartime. So, I mean, he carried his love of natural history throughout his life for him. And I think that not a lot of people knew this. And I think that one newspaper described it as, you know, as a significant tick in his box as a human being. That's not quite how I, but he's still a very controversial character. Yes, I think it's helped to soften his image and for people to see him as a human being, which he was, rather than just a politician, because even politicians are human beings and have a hinterland. I think the other thing I wanted to say as well was, you know, good luck with as I understand it, your tourism board is going to be launching a big campaign in October to get people to come back to the Bahamas. I think that's really important that you do that. And and if there's anything I can do in relation to that, I would be delighted to do so.
Oh, wonderful. Great to hear. And yeah, we will take you up on that. The other question is how, this is directed to Mr. Curtis and Mr. Jones again. How cost effective is the cultivation of mushrooms opposed to importing food?
All right. Well, sorry, I didn't fully answer the last question, so I'll just start off with that in terms of looking at the density. So it is a consistent density throughout the material, and they do vary based on the fungal species that you do use. So, and it depends. So for example, like in our case where we use oyster mushrooms using casuarina, like wood chips, compared to coffee, we noticed that, you know, after a period of like 80 days, we do get a more dense material with casuarina for obvious reasons, because the material properties of that parent substrate is obviously just more dense than coffee. And then when you look at species such as like oyster mushrooms, they tend to form just more rigid structures compared to like shiitake that gives you more of a foam-like texture. So, you know, it really depends on the combination of fungal species as well as parent material that you use that can determine the density or material properties of the outcoming micromaterial. In terms of the cost effectiveness, you could consider two things. So if you look at the environmental cost, you know, where we do import food from as far away as the UK or California, for example, you know, all of the food that we import, they have things associated with it called food miles. So if we're importing something from 1,000 miles away, we think about the environmental impact or CO2 emissions that are just, you know, facilitated with just bringing that food in. So there's that environmental cost. The other environmental cost we need to consider is that we're actually growing mushrooms off of waste. So it's not like we're buying like substrates from like a hardware store, from a wholesaler. Like we're actually upcycling grain waste as a substrate to grow this mushrooms. And so, you know, in terms of the economics of it, I think it's more economically viable to grow mushrooms locally than import. We said we haven't gotten to the cost analysis of setting that up locally versus importing, but we're looking at more the opportunities of, you know, stimulating a local economy, of processing organic waste, as well as being able to produce a biomaterial that is a direct substitute for things that have been listed on the styrofoam ban this year.
All right. All right. Thank you so much for that. And I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists. So before we conclude, I think my colleague, Giselle Jean, has a few announcements.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who has participated in the Bahamas Natural History Conference virtual webinar series over the last 12 weeks, especially the presenters who made time out of their day, especially getting used to this new normal thing, to give their presentations. Thanks to the BNT Communications Department for their support in helping run this thing. And thank you to the attendees for just coming to watch, whether it was live on Zoom or Facebook, or if you're watching this later on YouTube. So I just have a couple of slides here that I'd like to show. all of the previous sessions are recorded and have been posted on YouTube, except for this one, of course, which is still live. They are on the Bahamas National Trust YouTube page, and there's a BNHCV 2020 playlist that you can find on there. And also, please, if you can, support us. It's been quite the time for everyone, I'm sure, but the Bahamas National Trust is a nonprofit organization, and so if you can consider supporting us, we have a donations page up for this event specifically, right there, bnt.bs/support/BNHC-V. The page brings you to this. It is pay what you want. So, you know, you can pay $1, you can pay $10, whatever you can afford. We'd really, really appreciate it. Lastly, we have unfortunately made the decision to delay the Bahamas Natural History Conference to the year 2020. We are not sure what the situation of the world will be like next year. So, sorry, 2022, thank you, Eric. But that will be the 6th iteration of the conference. We hope to see all of you there. And now some words from our Executive Director, Eric Carey.
Hey, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Scott, for expertly facilitating this session. I want to just cap it off by thanking all of our sponsors, those of you who have indeed supported us, and to encourage those of you who can to indeed go to the support page and lend some support. All of you presenters who, certainly those today, but who've done this for the past 12 weeks, we really appreciate the knowledge that you've shared. You know, the reason BNHC was created was to respond to a need and also a criticism that a lot of the research was being done by non-Bahamians and then taken offshore, and the knowledge wasn't shared. BNHC was created to change that paradigm, and I think we've done a good job of that. Also, it's encouraged a lot of Bahamians to share their research, and we've had some quality presentations from our Bahamian colleagues. Especially thanks especially to the participants, the viewers. Without you, there would be no forum for people to listen to, no conference. Special thanks to the staff, the communications team, figured out all of the mechanisms of making this happen. You know, Elijah and Rovan and Anna, thank you very much. To the science team for adjusting and coping with COVID-19 and still making this happen. Thank you for all your hard work. And of course, please join me in a huge thank you, especially to Giselle Dean. Giselle took this on, had to figure out a new normal, and did an amazing job. So Giselle, hats off to you. Thank you so much for a job very well done. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good day.
All right. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Be safe and take care.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.